Hello and welcome to Piano and Keyboard Artist, where we discuss the artists related to pianos, keyboards and synthesizers. Now, if you're a regular subscriber to this channel, you will know that I've just interviewed Gary Numan and Fenton, and then I've also just done a very in-depth interview series with Fenton in person at his studio in Bath on my Geek Talk series, and we have covered a lot of ground, and we're in the middle of that. We're currently on part 2. Part 3 is coming out soon, so if you have just stumbled across this channel for the first time, I want to welcome you with open arms and tell you, if you're a Gary Numan fan or a fan of Depeche Mode, bands like that, OMD, Pet Shop Boys, Talk, and you know, if you're into that vibe, and indeed many other great piano artists, then this is the channel to be, because this channel covers content and artists such as these in a very in-depth way, and has made the channel quite unique. Before we jump into the content, it's roundabout now that I usually give a shout out to our sponsor, but there is no sponsor for this video. But I would like to bring your attention to my single, which I've just released from my up-and-coming album, and this single is called Sleeping Dogs. Do give it a listen, and if you like it, you can support this channel by buying a copy of it on Bandcamp, and any support that we get from you, monetary or just your subscription, is greatly appreciated. Right, let's jump into today's video. Right, so in my Geek Talk series of the Fenton special, in part 2 we covered a lot of ground, you'll know if you watched it. But a fascinating subject that arose was the fact that Gary Numan is now decided he is going to re-release Sacrifice, Exile and Pure. Now, I was very excited to hear that. I was a little bit surprised because, you know, if you've watched my previous interview with Gary Numan, and indeed any interview with Gary Numan, you will know that he's very anti-nostalgia. He kind of, what's he saying? He says, I'm going that way and you can come with me or you can stay behind. So it was very interesting to me, the fact that he's decided to address these 3 albums. But there is a very good reason for that. And in fact, the reason I'm making this video is because a lot of you have reached out to me and said, hey man, Vaughn, do you have any more information on this? Do you know about a release date? I can just say to you off the bat, no, I do not know any dates. And if I did, I would not be at liberty to tell you. But no, I do not know any release dates. In fact, obviously I've been in contact with Gary Numan because he's obviously, you know, promoting the Fenton special, and he's been very kindly sharing the content I've been doing on his channel, which has helped a lot. But obviously I've been in contact with him, and I asked him recently, hey man, any news when, you know, these 3 albums are coming out? And I knew what the answer would be before I asked, and I assumed that all focus is on Intruder at the moment. And I'm sure if you're a fan like me, you've probably been blown away by Intruder. So all the focus and the attention is currently on Intruder at the moment, and that makes sense because Gary does not want to murky the water. He needs to focus on just Intruder. So of course, Gary did come back with an answer, and that was exactly his answer. There is no release date as such, but Gary has agreed to come on to the Vaughn George YouTube channel again to do another interview, because what I've asked Gary was, I said, look man, I'm very excited about this series. When you do get to the point where you're releasing Exile, Sacrifice and Pure, I would like to interview you again, and I want to do a little mini series on those 3 albums and hopefully talk to Fenton again, because I'm quite fascinated by this project. So let's run through the story so far as I understand it. Now please understand that I'm going to try and be as factually correct as what I can, and if I make any mistakes, do not hold me out to it. I'm not officially representing Gary or Aid in this video. But from what I understand, Sacrifice, Exile and Pure have been re-recorded from scratch, which I think is a hell of a task. And the funny thing is, if you watch the video, Fenton told me that they've already finished Sacrifice and they've finished Pure, and they were halfway through with Exile, and they had to stop because they had to focus on Intruder. So wow, I just don't know where they get the time to do all this. So let's look at this. Sacrifice has now been re-recorded, And what we say by re-recorded, we mean everything has been programmed from scratch, everything. Gary's vocals done from scratch. The same with Pure. We're halfway through Exile, apparently, and they will finish that in due course. Now, once again, when Intruder has run its course and when Gary is ready, they will look at releasing these 3 records. Now, once again, I'm going to just say it was fascinating that Gary is, visiting nostalgia. But I think there's a very good reason for that. Now, if we look at Sacrifice, I'm going to be doing a album review on Sacrifice very soon. And Sacrifice, I think, is a very important record because it was the record really where Gary Numan kind of found himself again. And, if you know the story, he released some really rubbish albums in that sort of middle period. Having said that, I don't think they're as bad as what he says they are. But anyway, I'm a fanboy. He'd lost his way, clearly. We all know that Gemma put him on the straight and narrow. She introduced him to Songs of Faith and Devotion. And she said, hey man, why don't you just make a record but do it for yourself? And that's exactly what he did. He stopped listening to advice. He made Sacrifice for him, and boom, everyone went, hey man, that's where you're supposed to be. And Sacrifice was the album which started this successful path that he's on now. So it's a very, very important album. Now, so far as Gary sort of reworking these records, this is a very... people have got mixed opinions about this, and I'll tell you my thoughts. I love Sacrifice, I love Exile, and I love Pure. But when I did listen to... I pulled up Exile and Sacrifice probably about a year ago. I just sort of opened them. And I was quite shocked to hear them, not in a bad way, but just because I'm so sort of used to the sort of sonic quality of the last 3 albums. When you go back to Sacrifice and Exile, they sound like demos. They're not that well mixed, from a production point of view. However, what they do have is great atmosphere and melody and vibe and everything. So this is what is very important to Aid Fenton, as he said. When they re-record these albums, it's very, very important that they remain very faithful to the original vibe. Now, I can just tell you some inside information here. When I was interviewing Aid, obviously off camera, he pulled up a version of My Jesus from the Pure album, and he pulled up the new version that they've done. He loaded it into Logic. Logic is a music production software program, for those of you who don't know. So he loaded up the old version of Pure and the new version of Pure, and he played them not simultaneously. He A-B'd them. He'd play the old version and then he'd switch to the new one. And that way, I wish I could have recorded this, and we spoke about that, but we said it's probably not going to be legal because I believe that those records are on a different label. Is it Eagle Records or something? But because of copyright reasons, unfortunately, we could not do that. I'm hoping we can do it in a later video. But just believe me when I tell you that the difference was incredible. It was incredible, but it was at the same time being very faithful to the source material. It was My Jesus that was being played. We'll come back to this just now. If you watched my Aid Fenton video, part 2, you will see that I mentioned the Korg M1. The Korg M1 is this keyboard from 1988, and Gary Numan took that iconic sound straight off this keyboard. That's his sound, isn't it? But that's another story. We'll talk about this keyboard in another episode. Just understand that My Jesus, when I heard him A-B it was phenomenal. It was the same song. They had really kept the tempo and everything the same. It was important to Aid that they retained the vibe and everything. Very often you hear artists, they sort of redo records, and we often find what happens is, although the new record is sonically superior, they often tend to lose the essence and the soul of it. And from what I heard from those brief demonstrations which Aid gave me, they've not done that. They've really kept the soul of it really good. Some of the criticisms on Exile and Sacrifice. I mean, Gary, let's face it, he was suffering financially, and he did those on a shoestring budget. He did them all himself. He did the album covers, but I love those albums, and I'm not criticizing them. He recorded the vocals on an SM58, which is a sort of like it's a standard sort of like dynamic road rock and roll mic. Now, that's not to say you can't record vocals on that. Dave Gaughan's vocals were recorded on an SM57 for the Violator record. Now, that's another subject and another video coming soon, so let's not get off topic. But just understand that Gary Numan did this on a budget. But you can feel the love and enthusiasm in that record. And what I love about Sacrifice, it has this claustrophobic scariness to it. So I close my eyes and drift to sleep, but something is here in the dark with me. So, despite the fact that if we listen to Sacrifice and Exile and Pure now, despite the fact that they're not very well mixed and they sound a bit ropey by today's standards, there is a depth and a somberness and an edge and a darkness and a moody and broodiness to it that Aid is very keen to retain on these new records. And once again, from the A-B comparison I've heard, I was blown away. It's basically the older records, only better. Just quickly coming back to the sound of the Korg M1, yeah? I had quite a few producers reach out to me on my social media saying, producers who are Gary Numan fans, and one of them said, "Oh man, Vaughn, I wish I'd never sold my Korg M1 because, yeah, hey man, that's the sound of Numan." It's very easy to be critical about something in the past, but we must remember, once again, all things considered, Gary being on a budget and doing all that himself, you must understand that most people don't have the ears for it. They just listen to it and they like it. And that is exactly the way music is meant to be consumed. You're not meant to pick it apart and criticize it. But once again, on those A-B comparisons that Aid did between the old and the new stuff, you will not believe it, because if I look at, and I'll talk about this more in my Sacrifice album review, if I listen to Sacrifice, it's got all those loops and it just lacks that impact and that crunch, obviously, of the more modern record. So what they've done is, with the reworking of these three albums, is basically bring them up to scratch in line with the last three albums to give them that aggression and that punch and that deep bottom end, but at the same time remaining true to the roots of the original records. Some of the sort of, just go back and listen to Sacrifice and Exile, and just listen to the vocals, how boomy they are. I'm thinking of the first track on the album Pure, which is the track Pure. Listen to when it starts. It's just really dense and it's very cluttered. Listen to when Gary Numan's voice comes in and when he goes, "I want to feel you hesitate. I want to feel you pull away." Are those the words? Something like that. But just listen to the voice if you've got a good sound system. It sounds very muffled. The voice is very, very bassy. I don't want to get into music production here now, but usually you roll off a little bit of bass on a voice when you put it into a dense mix to give it more space. And it appears Gary never did that, so you've got this really boomy sort of woolly voice. But it really works because I love it in the songs like Absolution. He's got all these he's got all that, but on the lower notes when he goes it's got this deep sort of baritone droningness to it. And although some of those sort of lower frequencies in there, I don't want to sound like a geek now, but just understand that those records, technically speaking, when you listen to them, they just sound really cluttered, and Gary's voice is not pure and everything. But despite that, I always talk about it's about the atmosphere and the sincerity. And Gary scores 10 out of 10 for that, because those records have got real broodiness, atmosphere, and sincerity. Once again, I promise you that when you hear the reissues of these three, and I haven't been paid to say this, man, it's going to sound like those records, only better. The only difference with those three is Exile, Pure, and Sacrifice will be done from scratch. Jagged is going to be done again, but it's not going to be recorded from scratch. It's only going to be remixed. So what that means is all the original parts from the Jagged sessions are there, and then Aid Fenton and Nathan Boddy will get back into a studio and just mix it. Because, as we spoke about, now Gary Numan, being the very honest guy he is, he's made no hidings about the fact that his hearing has suffered. You can imagine doing live shows for the last 40 years, back in the times before you had in-ear monitoring. You can imagine the amount of noise and stuff. So his hearing has suffered, and that became evident on the mix of Pure and Jagged, because you must remember, if there are certain frequencies in your hearing that are damaged, you will not be able to hear those within the mix, and it'll obviously suffer. So Gary Numan has been very open and transparent about the deterioration of his hearing. Fortunately, thanks to technology now, he's got these like super duper hearing aids, and he can hear really well now. But anyway, if you watched my interview with Gary, Gary says, hey, I'm just a guy who writes tunes. He always puts himself down, but he understands where his strengths are. So he writes the tunes, and then it's left up to Aid Fenton to give us that, to take Gary's idea and develop it and present it in a great way, and then onto Nathan Boddy to give it that clarity. So it's a great sort of like team that they've got at the moment. So that's it really. I just wanted to do a quick scratch the surface video, although my videos are never quick. We're always going into a lot of detail. This channel is not for the faint-hearted, it's for the hardcore fans. So I'd like you to leave your comments in the description below. What are your thoughts on this project? Are you excited about it? Are you not bothered about it? And if you're a producer and you want to get some geek talk into this, I would be interested to hear what you have to say as well. Just once again recapping, Sacrifice, Exile and Pure being re-recorded from scratch, and then Jagged is just being remixed using the original parts. So it's going to be a fascinating project, and I cannot wait to see how it pans out, because once again, when I heard the A-B comparisons, it was phenomenal. It was just like goose pimples, as was. Wow. It retains the same vibe and everything. It's the way it should sound, and you are going to absolutely love it, believe me. Hit the subscribe button, leave your comments below. Lots of love to you all. See you in the next video. Adios.